We are live. Tagging you in this real quick, Ben, and then we'll get going. Sound good?
Sounds good. Did you intend to go to YouTube?
Yeah, I
Okay,
went to
can you give a
YouTube.
new link?
Yeah, I'm sending it to you now. Stand by, stand by. All right. 2 minutes before we get going here.
2 minutes. We need a little countdown.
I do need a countdown. That'd be cool.
When I was doing my amateur streaming, I actually had a countdown.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome.
Yep. Stream begins, and at first it was like 10 minutes, and I was like, it's way too long. I think it ended up going down to like 2 minutes.
All right. 1 minute. Uno momento. I think that's how you say 1 minute in Spanish. I'm not sure.
Un moment.
I don't know. Maybe. I'm pretty sure I just took Spanish just to meet the requirement, and that was about it. Not positive.
You also have your name there, Drew, in the participants section, your full name instead of timeout.
Yeah, that's something different.
Do you want to change that?
That's not me.
It's not me.
No, it's fine for now. All right, you ready to begin?
Interesting. Yeah, man. I think so.
All right, let's get this going since we've spent
12th time's the charm.
Yeah, 12th time is the charm. All right, I'm going to push the record button again.
Alrighty, here we go.
Stand by. Here we go. And clicking the button for recording. Okay, looks like we are recording.
Click that button to record. Looks
pushed
good.
the button
Push the
to
button.
record.
There you go.
What's up, dude?
You know, not a whole lot. I was just thinking to myself, should I ask you how you're doing? Because we've now asked each other that question about 4 times because we had just some minor technical difficulties. But you know what? I'm doing pretty good, man. You know, how are you doing?
I think now that we've gotten through these difficulties, I think it's good.
I think it's a learning curve, learning process.
All right. Well, we got through those technical issues, and yeah,
I think I'm ready. Them, or do we kind of just skirt around them?
I think we just kind of, I don't know. I fumbled through this whole thing, so hopefully it works out today. We'll see. This is going to be a interesting podcast, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've taken a bit of a break. It's been like what, a week?
It's been at least a week.
Yeah, you know, though, when we talked on our leadership one, when we started the leadership series, which we are taking a break from in order to do this podcast, we talked about taking a break, and it's just so happens that our podcast is called Time Out. So it's good for us to take a break every once in a while just to clear the head, I think.
Totally planned from the very beginning.
Of course. And you know what? I think we definitely needed a break because this one is going to be a tough topic. So,
indeed. Absolutely.
But before we get started, whiskey, do you have some?
There you go. That's more abrupt than your usual questioning.
Much more abrupt. I'm ready for some whiskey.
The technical difficulty's been that bad, man.
Yes, I'm stressing.
I guess so. Well, hey man, I got myself a little glass of whiskey here, so raise it up to you to digital cheers.
Digital quarantine from the COVID-19 cheers, my friend.
Oh man, cheers, buddy.
Let's
get after it.
All right. Okay, so this was going to be a difficult topic this evening, and that's okay. But I think this is the one that we've been thinking about getting after for a while.
I think this topic is going to be difficult, not necessarily because the content is difficult, but because it is uncomfortable. Previous podcasts that we have done, I think some of the material has been challenging, but it wasn't necessarily uncomfortable material.
Yeah.
Tonight, I think, will be uncomfortable material.
So what's this topic that's going to be so uncomfortable?
So this topic is one that we actually tend to have our Real Porch Talks on.
Yeah.
And that is death and the meaninglessness of life. Going to be a bit of a doozy. When we were talking about potentially doing one of these for our podcast, I know you had mentioned that you wanted to give a little bit of a disclaimer. Do you want to go ahead and do that now?
Yeah, man, definitely. So this topic is difficult, and it does deal with some more, I guess, depressing themes, some really heavy hitting themes. And so the warning is that if you're not in a good place in your life right now, maybe you're going through some stuff, having some difficulties, maybe you're in a bit of a depressive state, I would recommend probably not listening to this particular podcast, at least not right now, unless you are prepared to walk the dog on this topic all the way through. And I'm just going to say right now that when I started to approach this topic myself, it took me a very long time to be able to get through it emotionally. So that's the warning. So please, if you're in that state now, I recommend that you don't listen to it. And if you do listen to it and you've got questions and stuff, Ben and I are here to definitely answer anything that you may have. If you want to toss it our way, if you do find yourself maybe going down into a bit of a hole because of this topic, then we definitely ask that you reach out to your pastor or counselors or confidants, mentors, whoever might be able to talk you through this if it gets to that point. So that is the seriousness of the topic. And Ben and I have kind of avoided this. Yeah, I think you and I avoided this for this particular reason for a little bit now. But I do think it's important for us to talk about it. And I definitely think that it's something that you and I have a major vested interest in, because you and I have both struggled through this topic, both together and separately. So that's the warning. That's the warning. And so please take it seriously, because this is not going to be an easy one. What you got? You got anything else to add to that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. This topic is one that kind of wrecked me for a little while, and I really had to work through it. But I definitely noticed that I was in a much, I guess, lower state while I was trying to kind of work through this. And one thing that's interesting, this was really, really articulated for me when I read through Leo Tolstoy's book, Confessions. And I guess I'd had some kind of ideas about this before, but it wasn't really well articulated until I read that book. And what's interesting is one of the things that he talks about, this is actually in our very first podcast episode, where we read through one of the little Eastern parables that he shares. And in this parable, there's a guy in a well, there's monsters above and below, and he's hanging on by a branch. And on that branch, there's some honey, and he goes over and he licks up the honey. And that honey is supposed to be symbolic of like the pleasures and joys and things of life. Yeah. But he wrote that after he came to the realization of some of the stuff that we're going to talk about tonight, the honey no longer tasted sweet. And that really kind of struck me. And I kind of felt a little bit of that as well as I was going through it. So, take worrying seriously. If you're not in a great spot, this is probably not a topic that you want to delve into. But I also don't think that it's a topic that should be completely avoided. Just because something is uncomfortable doesn't mean that it shouldn't be discussed. As long as we go about it carefully, wisely, and if we do start spiraling down, that we have the awareness to reach out to other people to help you out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great. So like you were saying, this is probably going to be the most porch talky talk that we have.
Porch talky talk.
And I'm sure we again, like most of our conversations, we might not get through all of it tonight, but we'll definitely try to chat about it. And I think when you and I sit down on the porch in person, this is what our topics usually lead to, I think, is this. And you brought up a good point. Like our logo has those mice around it, and we talk about time a lot. So let's talk about that, man. Let's talk about time for a second. So I was having a conversation with a coworker this week, about time. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I really don't think that people quite understand like the gravity, the speed, the what's the right word for that? Basically, what's that?
Urgency.
Yeah, the urgency, basically how fast like your time goes, like how quick it is. I mean, if you think about it, like, and that's why you always hear people say like, "Whoa, man, that time flies." But I think that's probably the most flippantly used like phrase ever, because they don't really grasp it. And I'm not saying everybody, right? But I think for the most part, we just use it. It's just this phrase that everybody says, and we don't really take time to think about what that actually means. Like time flies. Like, man, dude, it feels like just the other day I was in a completely different state, right? And before that I was in another state. And I mean, and I look back and it's 10 years, right? Just gone.
Goes by quick.
Even this morning, like you go into work, right? And you're like, oh, I got to be at work. But it's funny because then you end up at home all of a sudden. You're like, oh, wow, I'm not at work anymore. But that time seems totally different as you move through it.
I experienced that with road trips.
Yeah.
It's so crazy. Like I'll have like an 8-hour trip. I'm like, this is going to take forever. I hate driving. I don't want to do this. And the next thing I know, like I blink and I'm there. It's crazy.
There's a name for that, isn't there?
The highway hypnosis. I think that's more for where you are driving your regular routine, like drive into work, and your brain is so familiar with it, it just kind of shuts down and goes through the process and kind of speeds you up to get there.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Which I think Jordan Peterson talks about that. And we've mentioned this in a previous podcast, which is why life feels like it speeds up as you get older, because you've automated more and more of your routines. So your brain starts a routine, powers you through it, gets you to the end, and it's only like the novel stuff that you notice. And so it feels like it's going faster because we have so many routines.
Interesting. Yeah, it's a crazy concept. It really is, this whole thing of time. And we have so little of it in the grand scheme of things. I mean, we think to ourselves, like, everything's kind of partitioned out in these, like, I don't know, years. Like we look at these like goals that we have. Like when you're younger, like, oh, I can't wait to be 10. Man, when I'm 10, things are just going to be so great. And then 10 hits you, like, boom. And you're like, man, I can't wait to be a teenager. And then I can't wait to be 16 so I can drive. And then I can't wait to be 21 so I can drink, or 18 so I can vote, buy a gun, things like that. And you just set these goals.
Things in life.
It's weird that time is a goal, as if you're not going to make it to that, right? And you might not. Don't get me wrong. Like, you don't know. But like, all things being equal, and you don't have something crazy happen to you, you're going to make those time goals no matter what. Right. So it's interesting. I think that we do that as human beings. We have these like time goals, like, oh man, I'm going to invest for 20 years and I'll be rich in 20 years. Like, okay, yeah, the idea that you have to invest is a goal, but like 20 years is just going to come and go, boom, instantly. So I think that leads me. Go ahead. You're going to say something.
That's really interesting if you view time as a goal, because that is probably the only goal that you passively obtain.
Yeah. Without noticing it, without anything. It just comes and goes. And and it's difficult for us to gauge it almost. It's like when you're younger, and even when you're older, and you're looking at these things that are far out from the current moment that you're in, it seems so far off, but then you're there. You know, I hear a lot of people who retire from the military say, well, man, the time flies. Like I feels like I just went into boot camp and now I'm retiring after 20 years, you know? So the question that I always come up with is like, okay, well, like what's the point? Like what ends up being the point of all that time? And you were talking about the honey not being so sweet. You want to elaborate a little bit, like what that kind of means?
Yeah, so I touched on it really, really briefly. And in this Eastern parable that Tolstoy explains in his book Confessions, he's clinging from this branch in a well. There's creatures above and below, and that symbolizes like the inevitability of death. And he's holding on to this branch for dear life because he doesn't want to fall down. And there's the honey on there, and he laps up the honey. It just doesn't taste sweet anymore. And the reason it doesn't taste sweet is because he now has awareness of the frailty of life. And then at the bottom of that branch, there's the two mice that are circling the branch and they're gnawing at the branch. One is white, one is black. And those symbolize like night and day cycles. And every pass of those mice brings him ultimately closer and closer to death because he's really not going to have a choice in the matter. Like he doesn't have a choice. If he does nothing, the mice are going to continue to circle and the branch is going to break and he's going to fall down and meet his demise below. If he, tries to act either above or below those are monsters, and he's still going to meet his demise. So he paints this picture of just complete hopelessness. And in the light of that complete hopelessness, the honey, the joys, the simple pleasures, of life just don't do it for him because he's aware of the reality.
Yeah. And I think so many philosophers come to this conclusion, which I think is super interesting. Like you start looking at like Tolstoy, you look at Kierkegaard, you look at who's the one that Jordan Peterson always talks about?
Jung.
Yeah, Jung. I mean, all of these guys, they come to this conclusion about the meaninglessness of life. And I think it has to do with, obviously an aspect of time. I'm not going to, just dwell on time because time is only an aspect of it. But like, it just comes down to like everything we do is just utterly meaningless. Like, what did you do when you were 6? Like specifically.
I probably played outside. I think I had a little like round mini trampoline. And I remember jumping on that. I don't remember if I was 6 or not, but I remember jumping on that little round mini trampoline, played a lot of Legos, like created Legos. All those Legos are broken right now. They're in a box somewhere, disassembled, just off to the side. No idea what I built. A couple of them I remember, but like, yeah, that's kind of what I did.
I mean, so it comes down to like, did they have any meaning? I mean, maybe it did. I guess it depends on how you define meaning, but like, does it mean anything now?
Not
one
really.
bit.
No, not at all.
I mean, maybe perhaps that maybe you got some dexterity skills from that or motor skills from building Legos.
Fine motor skills.
Maybe that's what, got you here. But here's the thing is that, okay, when you're dead, does that motor skill matter? Does that motor skill matter when you're dead?
No, not really. Like not at all, because you're not using that motor skill when you're dead.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying is like that stuff didn't mean anything. And so when we start to look at the grand scheme of things, and I was having this conversation again with a coworker this week, it came down to when you pull yourself out and you really look at, like the universe, and you start to bring it back, and you stretch time across all that, like your little blip of a life, it just loses all the meaning to it. So we've talked about it on multiple occasions. And one of the things that I really dug into over the week is I'm going to approach this from more of a religious side here. Okay. One of my favorite books in the Bible is Ecclesiastes. Are you familiar with that book at all?
I am. Why is Ecclesiastes your favorite book?
Because it talks about how life is meaningless.
There you go.
So the very beginning of the book, it says, the words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. And it says, meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless.
And that's actually out of the Bible. Like that's in the Bible, man.
Straight up out of the Bible, which is funny because all these philosophers that touch on these topics of how life is meaningless, and then they try to figure out how we gain meaning in our lives. It's already existed in Ecclesiastes in the Bible. This comes back to our conversation about how there's no new ideas, right? Mm-hmm. And so
just kind of repackaged.
It's just repackaged. Yeah. And here it is sitting in Ecclesiastes. We're talking about it now. It's interesting because people are going to call me out on this, but the original word for meaningless in this text is hebel, which means vapor, roughly translated. So what he's really saying is vapor, life's a vapor. What he's trying to say is life is quick. It's gone in the blink of an eye. And everything that we do in life has absolutely no meaning after we're dead, because mm-hmm. you're dead. Mm-hmm. To not be born and to be dead are the same thing, is basically what you're looking at, right? And then he begins to compare these different aspects of life on where he was trying to find meaning. He being the person who wrote Ecclesiastes. Some say it's Solomon, some say it's other folks. They call him the teacher, but the teacher says that he sought wisdom, he sought riches, all these things to try to bring meaningfulness to his life. And no matter how much he did in any of those things, they all ended up just being meaningless in the end, because you're going to die.
Mm-hmm. So it makes sense. When, and I know I've mentioned this before, again, go back with Tolstoy in his book, Confessions, he shares how he was struggling with a severe bout of depression. And he was in like the prime of his life. He was very, very wealthy. He owned land. He had prestige. He was established. He had his health. He had a great family. And he had to hide a rope from himself so that he wouldn't hang himself. And he couldn't go hunting because he thought it'd be too easy to put a bullet in his head. So despite all these great things that he had, he was still struggling with this idea that it's just all meaningless and it just goes away in the end. So there's really nothing that death doesn't take away from you. I mean, you have things for a little while, but then ultimately it's just redistributed to somebody else.
Yeah. And who knows what that person is going to do with it. You know what I mean? And I believe it talks about it a little bit in Ecclesiastes too, but like one of the things that's always stuck with me is like when you work all this, your whole life for a goal or for obtaining something and then you die, first off, it means nothing to you at that point. But second, you don't know what your family or whoever it is you're leaving it to is going to do with it. Mm-hmm. Many times it gets squandered.
Do they say like great family wealth is lost by like the third generation?
Yeah, it's usually like 3 generations or so, and it's gone. And the question that I always have is like, I've asked this to numerous people. Like, what did your great grandfather do that was significant in his life?
Mm-hmm. The great grandfather question. What is the name of your great grandfather? I have no idea. Moreover, I have no idea what his single greatest lifetime accomplishment is. I have no idea.
None. And do you even know your great grandfather's name?
I don't.
Exactly. So did what he do, was it meaningful?
I mean, perhaps it was valuable to him in his time, but in the grand scheme of things, there seems to be a little bit of arbitrary meaningless to it.
I mean, I suppose you could argue, right? And here we go, porch talk time.
Here we go.
I suppose you could argue, let me know what you think about this, that the meaningfulness comes in the ripple effects that happens from his actions. So,
Okay.
for example, he had
So are
a
you
son
trying
or
to say
daughter,
like a legacy kind of thing? Is that where you're going?
kind of, but the legacy ends up being like a bloodline, right?
Okay.
So you exist because your great 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 grandfather, had a child with
Hmm.
somebody. So is there meaning in that? Because let's say you continue to boil that down. And now you say, okay, well, if there is meaning in that because now you exist, what meaning does your life hold once you're dead? And
Hmm.
so on and so forth. So if every time somebody dies, their life was, or what they did was meaningless in their life because they're dead, they don't get to experience anything from it from a personal aspect. So it has to carry on to the next person. Every time a person dies, it's just continuous meaninglessness.
Meaninglessness.
There we go. Do you see what I'm trying to say there? Does that make
Hmm.
any kind of sense?
Yeah. So just because a family line is propagated doesn't like intrinsically build meaning. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. If that's the case, then the only meaningful thing you do in your life is to procreate,
Interesting.
right? Or perhaps meaningfulness comes from the things you do for others to make their life better.
Mhm.
But in the grand scheme of things, they're going to die anyway. So what does it matter if you do something good or bad?
That's true. Death destroys everything.
Death destroys everything.
I feel like you're kind of getting at like legacy, like things that you leave behind. Um, this is probably going to sound super harsh, but this is I guess, our harsh,
Yep.
difficult podcast.
Yeah, do it.
It seems, at least to me right now, it seems like the idea of legacy is something that the living tell themselves to give them comfort. Because when you are dead, you have no idea what your legacy is. Your
Yeah,
legacy does not benefit you in the grave because you are not aware of your own legacy. People who are living are aware of it. And so legacy seems like it's a beneficial thing for the living, but doesn't do you any good when you yourself die. Also, like people think about trying to make like grand legacies.
yep.
How great of a thing do you have to do to be remembered by a large number of people? So here's a question: how many people is it for you? Is sufficient for you that you would be happy to die if you were remembered by that many people? That was really confusing. If you died, how many people do you want to remember you? Just your family? Do you want your family and friends? Do you want 1,000 people? What is the number? How many people do you want to remember you? Now think about like the greatest people in history. There's very, very few of them. They've done fantastic things and they're probably known by a lot more than people.
Yep.
What is the likelihood that you will also create or do something of a magnitude of these historical figures that you will be remembered by thousands or hundreds of thousands of people? Okay. It is unlikely that the average masses, the greater majority of people, myself included, are so mediocre that we will never do something that will establish a lasting legacy that will be known by hundreds of thousands of people. The second component of that legacy is how long is long enough to be remembered. Do you want to be remembered for 5 generations, like our great 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 grandparents or whatever? I sadly don't. I don't know them. I don't remember them. Do you want to be remembered for, like 6 generations? Do you want to be remembered? How long is long enough to be remembered? Well, some people say, oh, like, what about like the founding fathers or something, like hundreds of years? If you take an evolutionary perspective and you think of like the world in evolutionary terms,
Yeah.
that time span is nothing. It is a little
Yep.
tiny blip. And so people say, oh, like 1,000 years. Like 1,000 years is nothing. So, given enough time, even if you manage to establish a legacy, I guarantee you at some point you will be forgotten. And
Yeah.
so then it kind of loops back on itself and be like, all right, well, if it is unlikely that I'll actually be remembered and if I'll eventually be forgotten in time, why should I even bother? Seems pretty meaningless. Really depressing, right? What do you think? Do those questions kind of make sense? Like, how many
Yeah.
people should remember me, and for how long do I want to be remembered?
Yeah. Like what the question becomes, at what point do you make the point, and at what point is there even a point? Do you see what I'm saying?
Mm.
If you're going to continuously strive for something that in the end disappears anyways, then why would you even bother doing it? I think a lot of people get there. I think a lot of people don't think about that because it's a scary thought.
Mm-hmm. It's very
I think
scary.
when you start to contemplate death, which I think everybody should do, I say it all the time. I think that if you want to truly enjoy life and not take it for granted, you need to contemplate death. And I think that you should experience it. Not like you should die. I'm saying,
Yeah.
don't
We are not
do that. I'm
advocating
not
that you
advocating
harm
that
yourself or anybody else for that. We are
exactly
not advocating for that.
at all. What I am saying is that when a family member dies, it is important for you to go to that funeral to experience those emotions and contemplate your own eventual mortality. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the right way to say that? I think that's the right way to say that. But anyhow, I think it's important because it puts a perspective. First off, time is short because let's say it's grandmother or grandfather, right? When you go to their funeral after they have passed, all of those memories flood back and you get a realization of how quickly it passed between that memory and now. And then you have to reconcile the future, even though the future hasn't even begun technically yet. You have to reconcile their absence in that future for you. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing about it is if you've ever experienced going to a funeral and dealing with somebody's death, you will know that if it's somebody that was important to you and had some impact and now you have an emotion tied to that, those emotions of loss will come in waves. But as time stretches out, those waves become less and less and less burdensome to you, right? In some manner. Now, granted, there are people who are traumatized by the death of an individual and it sticks with them for years. Mm-hmm. But I would say in a broad stroke, broad brush way of saying it, like I would say a majority of the people after a period of time, the significance of that death in their life, it dwindles. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so does everything else that you are doing in your life. For example, let's say that your goal is to get a degree in college, right? Out of college. And you strive for that in college and it was this massive goal and you obtain that goal and there's an emotion tied to that very specific moment of getting your degree. Fast forward 10 years. Does that same emotion still exist? Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying?
There's a question that I like to ask that loops on itself. And that question is, then what? And so, okay, I'm 10 years old. I can't wait to be 13. All right, then what? Okay, well, then I can't wait to be 16. All right, then what? Well, then I can't wait to be, 21 and be able to go and party and maybe go to college. Okay, then what? Well, then I'll get my degree. Okay, then what? Well, okay, then I guess I'll go work and maybe start a family for, several years. Okay, then what? Well, then I'll probably retire. Okay, then what? And you just keep pushing that question on and on and on. And then always the answer is, well, then I guess I'm just going to die. And so it's like, do you want to strive and struggle for all these things? Why do you want to strive for these things if you know you're going to die? Here is in my head, a non-religious point of view, like a secular thought process. That's honestly seems very reasonable. Okay. I know that I am eventually going to die. If I believe that there is nothing after I die, then it doesn't really matter when I die, just kind of go in the dirt and we're done. I also know that there is suffering and there's pain that exists in the world. And a lot of it I am completely powerless to grapple with. There is so much pain and suffering in the world that we just have no idea and we can't handle it. There's a book and oh goodness, what is it called? Waiting for Godot, I believe it's called. And he says the tears of the world are a constant quantity. Just as soon as one person stops weeping, another starts. And so like there's always pain in the world, and like we can't grapple it. So we have all this suffering in the world. I know I'm going to die eventually. I don't have the power to conquer all of it. Maybe I'm really not so hot off, and maybe the suffering in my own life is pretty bad, more than the joys that I experience on a daily basis. If I'm going to die eventually, why shouldn't I just kill myself right now? That's a very, very spooky train of thought.
Yep.
But that is a realistic thought that I think that many people probably have. And in that line of thought, there is a built-in hopelessness. That sweetness of the honey is gone. And that's a very scary, and I would say probably also a very dangerous place to be in. And so that's why we gave that warning at the beginning of this talk, because when you start to grapple with the idea that we will all eventually die, and that death can render things in our life and our achievements meaningless, it can leave you in a pretty hopeless spot. We're not going to stop there. We're going to go to the other side of the coin towards the end here eventually.
Yeah.
But that's kind of like, in my head, a secular, non-religious way of looking at things that really will sink anybody into hopelessness for sure. Also, I wanted to just go back real briefly. You had mentioned, going in, and everybody should go see like a funeral. I've been reading about coping a little bit lately, and one characteristic of healthy coping is a coping mechanism that gathers additional information. That's a aspect of healthy coping. When you go to a funeral, it reveals the realities of life and death, and that can actually sweeten life for you and help you to enjoy things more, because you know that it'll eventually come to an end. It helps you to kind of gather some information. Another quick last random thought, and I'll throw it back over to you. This popped in my head. I don't remember exactly what you said, but it popped in my head. I heard this somewhere. It's also kind of depressing. You can think about the number of times that you see your family in the year. So say you're a child out of the house and you see your parents only on Christmas. All right. Well, you can take like the average life expectancy of most people in your area, see how many Christmases you have left, and you can count the number of Christmases that you have left with your parents. Like, I don't know, that just kind of popped in my head.
That's super depressing.
Right? So like we were saying, time flies by, and if you're not attentive to it, like it just goes. It doesn't care if you're with it or not. It just goes and goes and goes. In the New Testament, there's an interesting verse, and one of the disciples is talking to Jesus, and he says something along the lines of like, "Teacher, like, look at these magnificent buildings." He's blown away by like, I guess like the structures that he's seeing. Maybe he hasn't seen them. Maybe it's like a big city. And Jesus looks at him and says something along the lines. He's like, "Look, I'm telling you, not one of these stones will be left on top of the other." Now, there's contextual information that you should definitely take and look at that, so we don't derive improper meanings from there. But I do think that one lesson that you can derive from that is that time has a destructive power. That's all I got. Throw it back over to you.
Yeah. So, I mean, the whole concept of time, again, keeps rearing up. So I think these are both like meaninglessness and time are intertwined, obviously. I think that the question obviously has to come to, again, what's the point? What are you going to do? So back to your thing about whole, like, if you've grappled with the meaninglessness of life, it might come down to the point where you just think that being dead is the best thing for you, right? Because ultimately it's where you're going to go anyways. You're going to have all this suffering along that path. And so ending it now is probably the best option, right? That's one option. The other option is, and by the way, I'm going to throw a couple big words out there. So what we're talking about here is when you start to say that life is meaningless, that's called nihilism. I think I'm saying that right. Nihilism. It's the idea that life is utterly meaningless. So when you've come to the conclusion that life is meaningless and doesn't matter what you do, you have two options. One, you can end it. We have multiple options, obviously, but two main options
Don't you dare set up a false dichotomy on us. Logic throwback
Oh
podcast number. I
yeah,
don't know what number
buddy.
it
There
was.
you go. Logic
I learned
throwback
something.
during the depression or the depressing podcast that we have.
Mm-hmm.
So the other option is what's called hedonism, which is just doing all the things possible that bring you ultimate pleasure in every single moment that you have, as much as you possibly can.
Interesting. I want to come back to that in a minute. I'm gonna
Okay.
make myself a note. Go ahead.
So basically, like, okay, so if life is meaningless and we're going to, eventually die anyways, then I might as well do all the things that make me happy as much as I possibly can be happy in whatever manner I define as happy.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
And that can be scary because if you have like some really corrupt character and your definition of what makes you happy is something utterly vile, you have just created for yourself a justification of why you can do something vile.
Well, and this is where the concept of meaninglessness it starts to break down, is that define vile in terms of a life that's meaningless.
I don't know how you can.
You can't. Mm-hmm. You start to get to moral subjectivity or moral relativism, right? Where whatever you feel is right is right. And so again, you can see how this whole meaninglessness thing can start to break down how you view the world and yourself and your mortality, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what were you going to say about all that? Go ahead.
All right. So here's an interesting thought that I had a while back. All right. So if we say that, if we allow ourselves to say that everything is completely meaningless, right? We allow ourselves to create some subjectivity by the things that we say we enjoy. So like we talk about hedonism. That's what I want to get to, hedonism. So like, okay, here's my thought process. Everything's meaningless, so I'm just gonna like live a wild, crazy party life, have as much fun as I possibly can. It's gonna go wild. If at the end of the day I'm gonna die, nothing matters, then I can do basically whatever I want that is best for me. Doesn't do me any good to care about other people. What serves me best is then best because it doesn't matter anyway. So I'm just gonna go wild. As an individual gains more power over other people, he can do increasingly worse, that we're going to use our definition of worse, I guess, like increasingly worse things and justify it. And so when one person says, oh, well, that's wrong, you shouldn't do that. Another person says, well, we're all going to die anyway. It's meaningless. Like, I'm going to do what I want. If that person has more power than the other person, then he can just take them out. Like, I'm talking about like physical violence here. And so you see this descent into arbitration of ideas by physical force. And so then you start to see things like, okay, well, I think that this race is better than another race. And if everything is meaningless and I have the power to do so, I can justify to myself to eradicate another race. Like, that's horrible, right? But you can see how you can just start this huge rabbit trail and just start sliding down if you allow yourself to say that everything is meaningless. And so you're just going to party it up and do whatever is best for you. Because as you gain more and more corruption and you gain more and more power, you can do worse and worse things to other people. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it starts to break down all sorts of stuff in the structure of like humanity and existence. So, I mean, I guess you have to reconcile that somehow. And the question I've always had is, how do you, what do you use to reconcile the thought of meaninglessness? Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm going to go back to Ecclesiastes real quick, right?
And so, while you're looking that up, like, isn't there a verse in Ecclesiastes that you could use to maybe contend for some type of hedonism? Maybe not like an extreme hedonism. I think they call it Epicureanism, like eat and drink for tomorrow we die.
Yeah. That's exactly what it is. So he talks about all the time. He says, I've, because of the meaninglessness of life, I say that, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm not saying direct here. I condone the idea of eat and drink and be merry, right? And I'll have to look up that verse. But just going back to, one of the verses that kind of hit me, it says, this is in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, and it says, "Again, I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they had no comforter. Power was on the side of the oppressors, and they have no comforter. And I declared that the dead who had already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is the one who has never been born, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun."
Oof, that's heavy, man. It's interesting that the verse says that read again, the power was with the oppressors.
Yeah, so he says, he goes in both, and this happens a lot. It's like in Ecclesiastes, it's like, oh, this person has it bad, and this person has it better than this person, but it's still bad for that person because it's meaningless for them. It's meaningless for both. So yeah, the verse says, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they had no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter.
It's interesting. In Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, there is a line that says something along the lines of, there is a power to be had if you'll stoop down and take it. And he's referring to the power that you can have like by murdering somebody. Like there is power over other people through physical force, but you have to stoop to take it. And once it's been taken, it can't be undone. So it's interesting that the power is with the oppressors because there is a power through, terrible force.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to try to find, let's see here, if I can actually find it. So, I mean, if you just keep going through Ecclesiastes, everything he says, it goes down to everything. Everything he says becomes meaningless. Like it says, much dreaming and many words are meaningless, right?
Do you recall all the different things that he tried to do to find meaning in his life? So a little bit of backdrop for Ecclesiastes, if I understand correctly. It's written by Solomon or the teacher, if you want to, look into who actually wrote it.
Yep.
But it said that Solomon was supposed to lead like this kingdom, and God asked him what he wanted him to do for him. And Solomon, I guess, was like a little kid. And so he said, hey, I want wisdom so I can lead this great people because I don't know how to do it. And so God was really, really impressed with this. And so he gave him like crazy amounts of wisdom. And he also like blessed him like with riches and stuff on the side. And so they said that like Solomon was like the wisest person that ever lived. And this is the person that's writing Ecclesiastes. And so this guy that's been given all like this wisdom from God goes out, and you know like some of the tasks that he does to try to find meaning in life.
You mean in Ecclesiastes?
In Ecclesiastes,
yeah. So
different tasks.
If you start to extrapolate a lot of what he says, like he talks about, he went and got all the wisdom he could, and that was meaningless. And then he got as rich as he possibly could, and that was meaningless. So then he became poor as he possibly could, and that was also meaningless. And then he owned all this land, and he had all these slaves.
Like building projects.
He did all sorts of stuff. Yeah, he just tried to find, and then he ate and drank as much as he could, and that wasn't, that he could not satisfy the hunger for meaning, no matter what he did, because the constant looming shadow of death at the end of it all destroyed it. Super depressing.
Oh yeah, buddy.
So, I mean, and he recognizes that there's all sorts of stuff in life that happen to other people that become meaningless. So here's one he says right here. There's something else meaningless that occurs on earth. The righteous who get what the wicked deserve, and the wicked who get what the righteous deserve. This too, I say, is meaningless.
You know how you talked about a minute ago how everything is just kind of repackaged?
Yep.
That phrase to me sounds like our modern phrase of why does bad stuff happen to good people?
Yeah. Oh man, we could dive into that topic super deep. Like there's a whole answer to that. But the bottom line is either way, it's meaningless. At the end of the day, whether that person had a good life or bad life, when they die, it doesn't matter. if you don't believe there's anything at the end of it. You see what I'm saying?
I think that's the big caveat there, and you slipped it in at the end.
Yep.
If you don't believe there's anything at the end of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you want to maybe explore and maybe transition into a little bit of kind of like the Christian worldview for how to address this problem?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we can even touch on a difficult aspect of that if we want to dive even deeper on the religious side. I can throw out some of the thoughts that I've had about that in the past. Yeah,
Yeah, go for it, because I'm actually not sure what you're talking about right now.
Oh, okay. So the idea is this, is that if you're going to reconcile, well, let's talk about this first. So to reconcile this from a Christian perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
What we have to come to grips with is that at the end there is some sort of reward. We call it heaven, call it being in the presence of God. We talk about there being a place where there will be no more tears, or just always be joyful. Like there's nothing bad that's going on, period. Like nothing bad. Like if you could walk all day and your feet not hurt, all the things in life that suck will no longer be there. And so when you start to get to the point where you think that life is meaningless, you have to think about why it is that God has put you in that position. What's the purpose for you to be there? So there's a couple of ways that I go about this. One, it says it in Ecclesiastes, right? He talks about how the basically, I'm going to paraphrase again, the fruit of your labor, right, is there for you to enjoy, and it is a gift of God. So enjoy it. He also talks about like eating and drinking is there for you to enjoy. So enjoy it. These are gifts from God given to you in a moment of time that is short. So enjoy those things because it's a gift from God. So if you're trying to look at how life is meaningless and why would you want to strive for anything? Well, it's because those things that you're striving for, that you're experiencing, are a gift from God. The other aspect to this is when you start to say, why should I bother doing anything? The question that I always ask is, okay, I get where you're coming from, but why is it that you would want to spit in the face of the Creator who's giving you the opportunity to do those things?
Mm-hmm. So that statement right there presupposes that you believe in a creator. So that kind of reveals some of your worldview.
Absolutely. Yeah. So like I've said in past podcasts, I'm a Christian man and I believe in God. So that's going to be what I turn to for my beliefs in my worldview, like you said. But if you believe that there is a creator and that you should worship that creator in the way that you define worship, then why is it that you would spit in their face if they're giving you this moment or giving you the opportunity to have this moment? Mm-hmm. Do you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. So the Bible often describes God as, our heaven, like our Father.
Yeah.
Now, I know that you have kids. I don't have kids, so I'm throwing you on the spot here because I don't have personal experience. But if you were to give your kid something really, really nice that you planned, and then they just kind of were like, I don't want anything to do with this, and they stepped all over it and just completely ignored it, how would that make you feel?
Okay. Rephrase that real quick. You said, how does it make you feel? I'll be honest with you. I was reading and I missed that last spot.
No, you're good. So the question, I'm going to rephrase it for you. If you got your kids something really nice and you planned it and you made some special event to give it to them so that they could enjoy it, and then they like kicked it around and wanted nothing to do with it and just ignored it, how would that make you feel?
Okay. Well, obviously that's I'll be angry about it because you feel like they're ungrateful, right? It's not respectful. Maybe you worked hard to get it for them, or maybe it's because you're trying to show them love and they're not accepting that from you.
The reason I ask you that is I was trying to draw a parallel between the point that you just made about how, you said, I think, like, why would you spit in God's face and say all this is meaningless? obviously here on earth, we are not perfect fathers, but we have a perfect father in heaven. And I believe that he made this world for us. And like you said, it's for us to enjoy. So we have to be careful when we say that things are completely meaningless. Because like you said, if we were to use that analogy of like you giving your own son something and him just being like totally rude, just disregarding it, it's kind of disrespectful to the parent. In similar fashion, if we just go around and say that all this life is meaningless and it's worthless, it's almost kind of insulting to the creator, at least in my head.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that again, he's given us these things and these opportunities that he's allowed us to have free will. And one of these days we'll have to get into the conversation of free
I'm not
will.
ready for that one, man. You're gonna have to do that as a solo episode.
But free will, so much as it is from our perspective, is a gift. And so, and you know what, I'm going to get into it just a little bit here, because this is part of this. This is another issue you will have to wrestle with even if you believe in a creator, right? So we're going to assume a couple of things here.
Are we doing this? Are we doing this right now? Are we getting into free will?
Bro,
I am not
we're going to dive into this.
Let's do it.
Cheers.
Cheers, my friend. Good luck.
Here's what we're going to assume. We're going to assume that God is omniscient, omnipotent, right? Everywhere.
You want to define those words real fast?
Yeah. So basically what I'm saying is God can be everywhere and is all powerful. Okay. Now, I don't believe that our tiny little like salamander brains can comprehend all powerful, but try. And I also I also don't think that you can comprehend being everywhere, because when I say everywhere, I'm talking both in and outside of time. So now we're going to start getting a little deep. So if God can exist anywhere and everywhere at the same time and is all powerful, which means he knows everything, then the question becomes, does he know everything I'm about to do? What do you think?
Oh man,
leading questions. I'm
gonna go resolve the melody.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go with yes. I feel like he knows what you're going to do, and I feel like I know where you're going with that. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
So if he knows everything you're going to do, right, then means that you don't have free will. From the very basic definition of free will being that you can act without any sort of external interference, meaning that also,
so you're not locked into a choice. Like you have options.
You're not locked into a choice. You have options, right? And that those options, I would say, are not already known, because if they're already known, then you're locked into those. So that's why I said earlier, from our perspective in regards to free will, because I believe that that is a gift that God gave us as far as free will is concerned. Because if we operated every moment knowing that it wasn't our free choice, then that would make us essentially like robots to God, right? You see what I'm trying to say here? Mm-hmm. I am not saying that God is actually forcing you to do an action. What I'm saying is that he already knows the action that you're going to choose. And so therefore, no other action is possible. Now, if we're going to reconcile this with life is meaningless, why bother doing anything if God knows what you're already going to do? Mm-hmm. So if God already knows I'm just not going to do anything, or if God knows I'm going to be bad or good or whatever, what's the point? What's the point?
Then you could also make bad decisions and say it's not my fault.
That's assuming that you believe that God forced your hand in that regard. I'm not saying that he's forcing your hand. Okay. Because that would put the blame on God at that point. Mm-hmm. You are still making the decision. It's just that the decision and the outcome of that decision is already known.
But it wasn't forced.
So you have to take the idea, if you're looking at time as a straight line, that we exist on this straight line. Imagine it being a string, and you are balancing on that string, and you're walking from one point of the string to the other point of the string. God exists at every point along that string, right? Now, if I'm holding that string between two index fingers in my hand, and that's like a little balancing act, and you're walking along those strings, God exists in every bit of space outside of that string, if string is representing time, because time is not an aspect that God is bound by. And so not only does he exist on every point along the time, but he exists outside of time. And so that's the whole concept of being, omniscient, omnipotent. So he knows all of the things that are going on at every given moment. It means he also exists in every given moment, which means that everything you do is already known. Does that make sense?
It's a lot. So if you're holding a string and it's, like in between two hands, and you're holding that string, and God exists on every single point in that string, it's as if he is seeing your actions in real time. So he knows that you're going to do them, but he's also ahead of the action and behind the action. So like he knows what you're going to do, but you had the free choice of making it, but he's seeing you do it in real time.
Correct.
Is that kind of what you were saying?
Yes. And so it's not that he's forcing you to do it. He's not forcing your hand. He just knows what you're going to choose to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so then the question becomes, why do anything at all, or anything good at all? Or why would you pray? Or, why would you do anything?
All right. We're just going to go down the rabbit hole here.
Go for it, man.
Here's another thought. So
porch
God
talk.
God already knows that you're going to do everything. And he knows all the decisions that you're going to make. He knows if you're going to accept him or not. He knows if you're going to reject him. He knows all the people that will make that decision, which if that is the case, then you would ask, why would I bother going around sharing my faith and telling people about God if he already knows the people that are going to come to him? Like if I don't do it, is somebody else going to have to do it? Like, is somebody else coming to God dependent upon me? Then if I don't do it, like, or is the person's already good to go and he already knows? Does that kind of question make sense?
Absolutely.
It takes away solid question. It takes away the zeal and the motivation for any kind of missionary activity.
Correct.
Oh.
Here's the beautiful thing, because why would you go bother to spread the gospel or anything if God knows you're already not going to do it? The beautiful thing about all of that is that if you decide to do that, he knew you were going to do it, and God's will always happens.
Mm-hmm.
So regardless if you do or don't is going to happen, the question becomes is, would you or would you not want to be a part of it?
That's true. Get to enjoy, I guess, like we use like a Christianese word, like enjoy the blessing of being used.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is going to dive into some other topics. Like, I don't believe that you actually save people. I believe that God calls them and he saves them. All we are doing is just being a representation as best as we possibly can of what Christ would be like to the best of our ability, obviously understanding the fact that we'll never be exactly like Christ because we are a fallen creature, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
I heard somebody talking about this actually the other day. So the idea that like God obviously does like the restorative, regenerative work in a person's life. Like we don't have the power to do that to other people, but yet we are still told to go and, share the gospel, make disciples and all that kind of thing. And so there is a piece that God does, but there is also a piece that God asks us to do. And this individual is saying that these things run parallel to each other. I think it's D.A. Carson. Oh, you have to fact check me on that. I don't remember who said it, but the idea is that like God's work and our work runs parallel by his design. And that is super confusing. And like, that is not a nice, neat little box that I can wrap my head around. But that is one way that he kind of proposed that it works. Interesting. Man, we got off topic, like hard.
It's porch talk, man. No script at all tonight.
No script.
Yeah. I just think that it's one of those things that we have to comprehend is the meaninglessness of life. But see, there's a positive aspect to, I think, understanding the meaninglessness of life. Like, okay, I don't think it's wrong to acknowledge that life is meaningless. I don't think that's wrong. I think that's an okay thing to believe.
I think it's a starting point.
Correct. I think that the way in which you view meaninglessness is important because there's several aspects of life that benefit from being meaningless. For example, somebody hurting your feelings. It's one of those things where it's temporary. In the long run, it doesn't mean anything. And so if you can wrap your head around, yes, life is meaningless. If I'm a Christian, then there's meaning at the end, and there's meaning of things for the things that I'm doing for God as a Christian individual. Then the things that are negative in my life are water off a duck's back.
Mm-hmm. I think the key phrase that you said there was for God. So what I'm about to say next comes from a clearly, like, this is definitely a Christian perspective, like Christian presuppositions, Christian ideology. Towards the end, like actually at the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, do you have it? If you have it pulled up, maybe you can actually read it word for word.
Okay.
But he says, now that all has been considered, here is the end of the matter. And he says, what does he say? Read exactly. It's like, serve God and keep his commandments. You got it pulled up there?
Yeah, I'm looking it up right now.
And so after he goes through all these things, he tries to find meaning in wisdom. He tries to find meaning by drowning himself in pleasure. He takes on great building tasks, all these different things. And then this is his conclusion at the end of the book.
He says, it's Ecclesiastes 12:13. And he says, now all has been heard. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil.
There's a verse, it's Micah 6:8, and it says, he has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. And so that's really, I think, the key phrase is for God. Whatever you do, do it as unto the Lord. I think that two people could do two identical tasks, and one person do it for the Lord and it would have meaning, and the other person just be doing it and it would be meaningless. That might be a bold statement to make.
I think it's pretty spot on. It's interesting. One of my favorite philosophers is Soren Kierkegaard. Right?
I still need to read him, man. I haven't read anything about him.
Yeah, he's awesome, I think, and he's I guess he's kind of a Christian philosopher. I mean, he definitely is a Christian. He's considered the father of existentialism.
I hope nobody's having existential dread.
And existentialism is basically a theory which emphasizes the existence of the individual person as a free and responsible agent determining their own development through acts of the will. So basically, like, you kind of create your own meaning, right? He's kind of the father of that, which is interesting because he also has what he calls 3 stages of life: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious.
Okay.
And you kind of go through these phases, and basically,
are they age related or are they like developmental?
Developmental. Okay. For sure. Yeah. So like the aesthetic stage.
So when I think, I'm sorry, I'm just looking for clarity. When I think of developmental, I think of like growing. Is this like a mental maturity kind of thing? Like developing in your thought process?
Sure. Okay. Thought process, belief systems. I mean, obviously it could be tied to age because typically children exist more in what he considers to be the aesthetic like stage of life. Basically what aesthetic means is like, it's like concerning like beauty, right? The appreciation of it. What he's really getting at is like the things in life that you enjoy. So your first stage is you do things that are pleasurable to yourself without much regard for the ramifications, right? And then you move into the ethical stage. And that's more, I mean, obviously ethical pertaining to ethics. And that's like moral principles, considering others, considering the ramifications of your actions, right? And then the final stage of life he considers to be the religious stage. And I don't have the quote pulled up, and I'd have to get the exact one, but basically what he kind of says is that faith is the ultimate end of development for an individual because it requires you to believe in something that you cannot necessarily prove. And to be at that point means you've considered all other things as much as extent as possible. And so faith is your final stage, basically. And I think that when it comes to the meaninglessness of life, if you dive into it deep enough and long enough, there's not much other answer than there's no other reason to exist other than for there to be a being that makes it meaningful. Mm-hmm. Like I said earlier, like things start to degrade. When you start to go to meaninglessness of life, ethics and morality start to go out the window totally. Like it means absolutely nothing. Like you start looking at the grand scheme of things. I had this discussion the other day. In morality, it's like, okay, so what's your basis then? And we've talked about this before. What's your foundation for morality? That all has to tie into meaningfulness, which means that there has to be something to make it meaningful, which means that there has to be an end goal to bring meaning to what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And so I think as you go through life, you have to determine whether or not what you're doing is meaningful for the end goal. And if the end goal is just death and nothing else, then nothing means anything. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Comes back to that death, man. Just destroys that old specter of death just keeps on marching, destroying everything in its path.
Let me pull up this quote real quick. So I'll go into this quote from Soren Kierkegaard. He kind of talks about the meaninglessness of life. And this is I don't remember what book this is exactly from that he wrote. I think it's Sickness Unto Death. I can't remember. But anyhow, fact check me on it. It says marry and you will regret it. Don't marry, you will also regret it. Marry or don't marry, you will regret it either way. Laugh at the world's foolishness and you will regret it. Weep over it, you will regret that too. Laugh at the world's foolishness or weep over it, you will regret both. It says, believe a woman, you will regret it. Believe or not, you will also regret it. Hang yourself, you will regret it. Do not hang yourself, and you will regret that too. Hang yourself or don't hang yourself, you will regret it either way. Whether you hang yourself or do not hang yourself, you will regret both. This, gentlemen, is the essence of all philosophy. Again, he's touching on meaninglessness here. And so again, it comes down to like, if either decision means nothing, then why even do anything at all unless you have that end goal in mind?
That quote sounds like something your disgruntled uncle says at Thanksgiving.
Right.
Like he pulls all the kids to the side and is like, look, I'm going to teach you a life lesson here, kiddos. And all the parents are scurrying over like, no, don't say anything. Don't listen to your uncle.
No, you're going to ruin Thanksgiving.
Ruin Thanksgiving. Disgruntled uncle every time. There is a quote by Charles Spurgeon. And Charles Spurgeon was a preacher, I believe, over in England. Pretty phenomenal guy. And he said something along the lines that if he was just given left to reason, and he didn't have faith, the only thing that would be left for him is the rope of Judas, which is an allusion to, Judas, who betrayed Jesus in the Bible and went out afterwards and hung himself. And so this great pastor is saying if he didn't have faith, the only thing left for him would to go and kill himself. So in my head, when I think about meaninglessness, it's a call to action. So I've said it many, many times. You don't know what you don't know, but once you learn, you become responsible for change. If you have never considered this idea that maybe life is totally meaningless, maybe you stayed up like late at night and you're just wide awake in your bed and you're thinking to yourself, what am I doing all this for? Like, why does it really matter? But maybe it was never articulated to you that life can be pretty meaningless. Now that you know, the honey might not taste sweet for you anymore, but there is a way to restore that sweetness. There is a call to action when you learn about the meaninglessness of life. And for me, and if I can speak for you as well, Drew, the antidote for that meaninglessness of life that we have found has been found in Jesus. And so, we gave a warning at the very beginning. This can be a depressing topic. We are at no point advocating for people to harm themselves or to harm others or to think that life is meaningless, so I just end it. Just so much suffering, I'm just going to get rid of myself. The world would be a lesser place for you not being in it. You have lots to contribute to the world, and you have no idea what your future holds. But for me and Drew, to get out of this pit of the idea of meaninglessness, there's this thing called the gospel. And in a really, really boiled down nutshell, is that there was this guy named Jesus long, long time ago. The Son of God came down to earth, took on a form in human likeness, lived just like us, and in his human form, he suffered and went through life just like we do. And because of that, he is able to relate to us. The Bible says that we don't have somebody that represents us that isn't unable to be familiar with our own sufferings. And Jesus came down because of his great love for us so that no one will be lost. And he gave his life as a sacrifice, a substitutionary death on our behalf, took the punishment that we should have taken so that we can have union and be reunited with the Father. That might turn off a lot of people. That might be offensive. But for me personally, the only solution to the meaninglessness of life is that I can call upon Jesus as Lord and Savior, and I can have hope because of the work that he did all those years ago back on the cross.
Yeah, man, definitely. I mean, again, it comes down to me, or for me, it comes down to how are you justifying anything you do without having a foundation upon which to base it on? Mm-hmm. And I touch on this a lot in many of my conversations because everybody says, well, let's start talking about the Bible. First off, you have to reconcile meaninglessness. You have to decide what makes meaning in your life. And you have to understand what meaninglessness is. If you've come to the conclusion that everything you do is meaningless, then you have to have some sort of end state that makes what you do meaningful. Okay. The second piece is morality. And without a foundation, again, as you continue to tear back the layers, you will find that, all right, for example, why don't we kill babies? Or why don't we eat babies? That's a better one. Why don't we eat babies? Because it's more weird, I guess. Why don't we eat babies? What's the reason? Why don't we eat babies?
I would imagine that someone would say, we don't eat babies because it is wrong.
So the question becomes, why is it wrong?
Because killing is wrong.
Okay, so why
I'm trying to play along here.
Yeah, absolutely. So why is killing wrong?
Because society thinks killing is wrong.
Okay, so why does society think that killing is wrong? So my point and what I'm getting at is as you continue to peel it back, okay, look, why does society think it's wrong? Well, because we realize that we can't kill each other if we want to be able to move forward. Why is that important then? Because now I'm bringing it back to the meaninglessness thing. Why is it important for us to not kill each other? Well, we need to strive forward as a society. Well, if life is meaningless, then that doesn't matter. So then why is it wrong to kill each other? Okay, well, because we've learned that it hurts, and if I kill somebody, I might have somebody else come and try to kill me. Okay, so what stops any of us from doing any of that? What keeps the foundation of humanity or the society from just crumbling, right? It's a moral baseline. And where does that come from? If you continue to bring it back and back and back and back and back and back, you just can't find that foundation until you come back to, well, we have to have something from a higher power deeming whatever it is wrong. That's why we have laws.
Law.
That's why we have laws, right? And so if you tie in meaninglessness and a lack of foundation for morality, then there's no reason, there's zero logical reason for you to behave as society would deem it fit. Nobody should do it. And so that's why I personally believe that biblical foundation is absolutely crucial for both society and for ourselves in our own lives. And I've always challenged a person saying to them, find something for me that you think the Bible says is right that is actually morally wrong.
Say that one more time. Find something the Bible says
is right that society says is morally wrong, and let's have a discussion about that, because I can tell you right now that if the Bible's telling me to do X, Y, and Z, or that X, Y, and Z is good, and society's saying something else, I will guarantee that I can explain why the Bible's reasoning and what the Bible is saying, what God is telling us to do, is the right way to go. And that if you don't do that, things start to deteriorate. Mm-hmm. I've left that challenge open to anybody.
That sounds like it could deteriorate a little bit into a conversation of hermeneutics, because some of the conversations. So hermeneutics is like a rule of thumb. It's a way to approach interpreting really anything. I think there's hermeneutics for all sorts of stuff. There's hermeneutics for the Bible as well. And one of the hermeneutic methods that I have been taught is when you are looking at the Bible, sometimes there's things that they did a long time ago that we probably wouldn't do today. And so how do you reconcile those things? And what is the book? I think it's called Grasping God's Word. And I don't remember who it's by. I think there's a little rock climber hand on the front. But anyway, they say that the one method of approaching difficult scriptures where you want to try to apply some rules to a modern day audience is first you look at the immediate context of whatever scripture you're looking at. Then you kind of look at some of the bigger, context surrounding it. You need to think about what it was like in their day and what the meaning would be to those people in those days. Then you need to try to think about the differences that exist between yourself and the other person. So okay, well, I'm not an ancient Israelite. I'm not living out in the desert. I have very different circumstances. Okay. Then you look for things that are similar. Okay, well, we both fear God. We both want to live good lives. You kind of find things that are similar. Then you look for a way that you can find something that is similar to them and similar to you that would be applicable to the rest of Scripture. So you get some kind of principle, and you compare that principle with the rest of the canon of Scripture. That's just a fancy way of saying the rest of the Bible. Make sure everything kind of gels. Then you can move forward with it. So when you talk about, finding things that, aren't answered in the Bible, a lot of stuff is answered in the Bible, but it's also easy to nitpick verses out and then just kind of take them out of context. And so there is an appropriate method to approaching some of those things. That was random and for free today. There you go.
It's interesting.
The whole podcast is.
How do you reconcile that with moral relativism then?
What do you mean?
So what? And this is here we go. We're getting again porch talk.
Porch talk. Let's go.
So how do you reconcile that with moral relativism, in that you were just saying you have to consider the time and context of in which that was being said, right? And then how it applies now.
So the main thing for that is you have to think about the semantic domain. So a semantic domain is a phrase that means words can have different meanings based in the context that they are presented in. Oh, I'm going to try to think of a sentence on the spot. Here we go. What's a good sentence we can use? This is not a good example. This isn't even the right ballpark, but I'm going to go with it anyway. Like, it's raining cats and dogs. We understand that to mean like it's raining like crazy outside. If you took that literally, you'd think it's actually raining cats and dogs, but that's not its meaning. That's one of its potential uses. So like you look a word up in the dictionary, there's usually not just one definition, right? There's lots of different types of definitions. It can be used as a noun, it can be used as a verb, it can be an adverb or something. So you have to look at like how they would have understood it, which is why it's important that people go back to the original languages if you can. That's not something I can really do.
Okay, so that's how you're reconciling the moral relativism aspect. Because what I was going to say is, like, for example, it's wrong for us to kill another individual in a for society, Western society. Like, it's wrong for us to sacrifice an individual to the gods, right? Mm-hmm. But then you go to some faraway country, some tribe who's secluded from the rest of society, and it's perfectly acceptable in their culture, right? This is another argument for moral relativism, because people will say, well, that's fine for them, but it's not fine for us.
So the claim is that culture determines morality.
Sure. So when it comes to the hermeneutics, right, now we're looking at moral relativism from their standpoint and our standpoint. So you're looking at across time now. Mm-hmm. And so what you're saying is that we have to understand what it meant to them and what it means to us. And there's a translation via principle.
Tricky
between
right?
Those two.
Tricky. Now we're kind of getting into a little bit of ethics. So like, remember a while back, we talked about that fancy word deontological, which is like a fancy way of saying like a rule or a principle. Like, it's like, if you can, first you want to go to like those hard and fast things, and then maybe branch out from there. But like, you can't just dismiss the fact that like different cultures do have different values for different things. Like, it just doesn't necessarily mean that they're it doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong. I'm going to say that so cautiously, because like you could take it extreme like in a second. There's a book called Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes, and it talks about how different cultures have focused in on some different aspects of things because it's more familiar to them. And one of the examples that I recall reading in there was there was, I want to say it was either being read or it was being told, but there's a story and a famine occurs and these people have to go away, and then they go and they prepare and they do all this stuff. And the things that the Westerners tend to focus on was different. And they actually, most of the time, completely missed the fact that there was a famine. They just glanced right over it because that was something that's so unfamiliar to them. It's not even like their domain of reality. But to other people who have experienced famine, that was the thing that they fixated on more because it was more culturally appropriate and aware for them. So like there is some degree of like culture influences how you perceive stuff, man. I don't know. We said it in the very, 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 very beginning. We do not have all the answers. Don't know anything. The more I read, the more I realize I don't know anything at all.
I'm right there with you. Yeah, I don't have the answers for you on that one.
Don't have the answers.
So again, these are things that we struggle with on a regular basis, where we have to reconcile it somehow.
That's why the porch talks.
Yeah. And you just keep digging and you keep digging to try to find the answer. So it's interesting because I had a friend of mine say, well, why is it that you keep trying to seek these things out? What's the point? If you believe that there's
a God, great question.
Sure. And it's, straight up is from Ecclesiastes. Like, what's the point of wisdom? What's the point of being a fool? What's the point of wisdom? Now, granted, wisdom in Ecclesiastes is claimed to be better, right? It preserves you. But in the grand scheme of things, why even bother? So the question was, if you believe in God, and that is a solid faith that you have, then why pursue the answers to questions that you might not get the answers to? And this is for my best friend. He's like, keep it simple. This is very simple. And then you've said something to me a while back, which I've held on to forever now.
I feel like I know what you're about to say. It is not mine to take. I heard it from somebody else. Again, we just recycle information.
It's just repackaged, baby.
Try to quote things, but man, we're probably just, what is that? Plagiarism.
Oh yeah, but it's the greatest flattery.
That's right. We appreciate you letting us use your information. Anyway, go ahead.
No, so why even bother? And I think that some people are inclined towards seeking those types of things out because for them, one, they need to know the truth and they need to have evidence and logic and those types of things behind it in order for them to accept the truth or maybe understand it more. And then there's those that accept it out of sheer faith, which is, man, that's awesome, right? Especially from a Christian perspective, that's amazing. And you told me one day, some people need a God that's bigger than their emotions, and other people need a God that is bigger than their intellect. And thank God we have a God that is bigger than both, right? And so I do not think that it is incorrect for somebody to ask these types of questions, which is why you and I have these Porsche talks, which is why it is that when people come and talk to us, we don't discount their ideas right off the bat, because I think it's important that we ask these kinds of questions, because there are people out there that have an intellect and it needs to be satisfied in some manner. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's important for us to be able to dig into those types of questions. So you were about to say something.
I was just going to say that quote is not mine. I shamelessly took that from my mentor. So just credit where due.
I do it all the time. Yeah. I'm sure he does it all the time. Mm-hmm. So, well, man, so I'm thinking this meaninglessness thing, we've kind of beaten it to death. And I mean,
honestly, I don't even know why we bothered doing this podcast tonight.
Yeah, it's completely meaningless podcast. What a waste of time. No, I think that we can continue to go deeper into this if we really wanted to. And as you start to look into the philosophers and things like that, especially, I'm a huge fan of Stoicism, even though it seems contrary to Christianity, even though there's some pretty similar aspects to it, or between the two, especially when you consider Ecclesiastes in the Bible. But, I think it's important for us to reconcile meaninglessness in our lives, especially if you're at the point in your life where you believe that life is meaningless. And I think that my advice to you, one, would be to talk to some folks. Definitely talk to some folks. And as Ben said, if you're there at that point, like the world is so much less without you here, and you don't know what the future holds. So please talk to somebody. The other thing is really investigate what the Bible has to say, what God's word has to say, what he says to you, because I think that a lot of people discount it to the point because of what they've heard from others and do not understand the complexities that are in those words. I mean, the Bible has so much to offer. And when we take it at face value from another face, meaning somebody else's face is coming out of their mouth, it can be misconstrued often. So I encourage you to really dive into what is it that the Bible is talking about. And I hear so many arguments about why the Bible is bad and contradictory. And I think that is a very, very surface level analysis of what the Bible has to say. And if you start to really look into it, you're going to find that there's a much deeper meaning that has one, moral and ethical solidarity with life and how you should be living it. And two, I think that if you follow the things that are said in that book and you listen to the words that God is speaking in that book and you do those things, you cannot go wrong, and it will bring meaning to your life. And the question of meaninglessness gets answered. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what I'm going to end it on there, man. What you got? Anything?
I think that is a good spot to end it on. my one last final thought that I have, there's a verse in the Bible and it talks about this guy and he is gathering up his crop. And he was tremendously successful. And so he gathers his things and he puts it in his barn and he's successful. And then he thinks to himself, well, I guess I'll build another barn so that I can store more of my stuff. But then the guy dies and all of his stuff is gone.
Surprise.
Where is
wait.
Yeah, all right. Where's the do you know which story I'm talking about there, Drew?
I do, but I don't know where you're trying to look it up at.
Gotcha. So God comes to him and basically says, like, like, you fool, like your very life tonight is demanded of you. And so this guy might have been trying to find meaning in his life by chasing after earthly status, material wealth. And then in a moment, all of it was gone. And so as you consider meaninglessness, the inevitability of death, that is something, it is a serious issue. And I definitely think it is worth grappling with. Even if you don't like faith at all, like you can kind of look at it from a logic-y side of thing, go and look up Pascal's wager. Very, very interesting. Pascal's wager is a logical based argument for the benefit of basically choosing faith. Go and check out Pascal's wager. That's my encouragement for you there at the end. But you have value, you are loved, be encouraged. Life is not meaningless when you have somebody that loves you and that's somebody that you can serve and that you'll eventually meet.
Yeah. And I think once you've grappled with it and you have an understanding, I don't think you should stop grappling with it, because the question,
it's a one and done. It's not.
Yeah,
one and
absolutely
done.
not. No, you're going to continuously grapple with these things in your mind. You're going to have to remind yourself over and over and over what it is that you're thinking, what you believe. And I don't think that it means that you shouldn't go do anything. Again, if you read Ecclesiastes, he talks about very specifically that things that you are enjoying in life are a gift from God. And so you should enjoy them. So I don't think there's another verse in Ecclesiastes, which is interesting, which says it's to your benefit. I'm paraphrasing again. It's to your benefit to not be at either extreme, whether too foolish or too righteous, right? It says that specifically. So I think that taking all that into context is important. And I think it's definitely a benefit to your life, and you can utilize meaninglessness of life in a positive way for yourself in many aspects. So, all right, man. Well, I think that we've come to the end of this.
I think our little outro is the most apropos ending that we'll have of any of our
Absolutely.
podcasts. It is like, this conversation here is the meaning behind our very logo.
Yep.
We always say it, the mice continue to circle. And I said a long time ago, I hope that it's not circling a void and that it's filled with that center there. That's filled with Christ. So, Drew, it seems like even though we have talked about all these things and the meaninglessness of life, and we did another podcast, the mice continue to circle.
Yeah, I think that even though we've talked about the mice continuing to circle, and we've tried to reconcile that as best as we can, that despite all that, the mice continue to circle. Listen, everybody, we really appreciate your time here today. And if you want to be on the show, please reach out to us. And
this has been a heavy topic. How can they maybe reach us with questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can go ahead and give us an email. Shoot us an email at timeoutletsthink@gmail.com. And you can also go ahead and reach out to us on Twitter at timeouttothinc. And additionally, on Facebook, you can reach us at timeoutletsthink. Also, this is on Podbean, so you can reach out to us there. So I think it's the end of our show, though, man.
I think so.
All right. Well, we appreciate you all listening. We hope you have a wonderful night and or wonderful day wherever you are. Please be safe, especially with everything going on in the world these days. And we will see you on the next show. Thank you and have a good night.
We'll see you next time, guys. Bye-bye.
All right. Dunskies.